Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. One of the top stories in the news these days is the question of carrying firearms, particularly in the wake of some of the violence we've seen around the country. In Illinois, a federal court has recently ruled that citizens do have the right to concealed carry of firearms. But tonight, to represent the other side of that story, is Lee Goodman, an activist with the Concealed Carry Coalition, to talk about why that may or may not be such a good idea. Lee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And our coalition is the Stop Concealed Carry Coalition. It's a pretty significant change.
Yes, it is. It is significant. So tell me about the coalition, first of all. Who is it? Why is it? And how does it operate?
We formed back in October of 2012, before the judge's decision, before this became a big issue, because we knew that the Illinois State Rifle Association, which is the state affiliate of the National Rifle Association, had been trying for several years to pass a law authorizing people to carry concealed weapons in Illinois, because you can carry concealed weapons in 49 other states. We're the only one where you can't anymore. So we formed a coalition the way that many of these things form. It was just grassroots. It was ordinary people from all around the state who signed up as a voluntary matter. And we started talking about not having concealed weapons and what kind of a danger it was. Now, since we formed, it just so happens a judge threw a monkey wrench into the works, and this has become a big hot issue, and all of a sudden we've got to respond.
So why is it such a bad idea to carry concealed weapons?
Because weapons kill people. And that's what they're for, that's what they're made for, that's what they're designed for, and that's the only thing they're good for, is killing people or injuring people or frightening them into thinking you might kill or injure them. And the experience in all of these other states shows that the more weapons there are accessible to people, the more people who will get shot, whether it's because someone gets angry over a parking space or over a girlfriend or someone just gets careless or whatever it happens to be. The more guns there are, the more people get shot. And we happen to think people getting shot isn't a good thing.
No, I think everyone would agree with that point of view. The other perspective on concealed carry, though, and the story that I'm sure you hear from the other side of the argument, is that if everyone were armed, the bad guys would think twice about trying to hold you up at the CTA or trying to knock you over at the ATM when you take out your money, and or any other kinds of violence and criminal behavior. And if everyone were armed, it would be a much more peaceful society because no one would take the risk because they know you can shoot back. What's the validity of that argument?
There's no validity to it. First of all, it assumes that there's such a thing as a good guy and a bad guy, and things are not that clear-cut. Secondly, it assumes that bad guys think about these things, and that's not at all clear-cut either. It's not necessarily true. And the other thing is, you take a look at what happens when the guns are around, and what happens is it escalates the situation so that instead of people having guns and that intimidates or frightens or makes other people think, what it does is it encourages the bad guys to bring their own guns and to attack first. And that's what's happened all over the place is people go and to commit armed robberies, for instance, at gas stations and burger joints and the rest of it. If they think that someone might have a gun, they'll bring a gun, and they'll be aggressive with it. If they're pretty sure that no one's going to have a gun, maybe they'll bring a bat, maybe they won't. So the more that we have guns around, basically, the more you have guns around. It's a self-fulfilling sort of escalation, and the result, unfortunately, is the violence escalates and more people get hurt.
So why is it so politically popular? If 49 states allow it, and Illinois doesn't, or not at the moment, what do the other 49 states think or know that we don't think or know?
Well, the peculiar thing about it is it's not as if the majority of people in those 49 states really support this. What you have is the National Rifle Association, which is the industry trade group for the manufacturers and sellers of guns, have managed to get an undue amount of political power all across the country. So they have put in laws, they've pushed through laws that, the truth of the matter is, people in those states really don't want. To give you an example, the Government Accountability Office released a study in July of 2012, and it looked to see how many people actually get permits to carry concealed weapons where they're available. 3.63% of adults in all these other states get the permits. Now that's almost nothing. That's about the same percentage of people who vote for Superman and the Green Lantern in an election. This is not to be taken seriously. So it's not that all around the country, people want everyone carrying around weapons, frightening and killing and shooting each other. But politically, just as we've seen in a lot of other issues, a small group, if it's properly organized, if it's properly funded, can sometimes accomplish things that are contrary to the public will and to the public interest.
So what was the federal judge's argument in allowing concealed carry in Illinois?
The federal judge took a look at the prior Supreme Court decisions. The primary one came down in 2008. It's the Heller decision, a follow-up decision in 2010. Those decisions said people have a right to to have a weapon in their home for self-defense, interpreting the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, that decision in 2008 was very strange because all throughout our history up until that point, the Second Amendment had been interpreted to say what it says, and that is a well-regulated militia. You have a right to bear arms.
The National Guard or the police or
whatever. It goes way back in history, but the Second Amendment, if you read it, says a well-regulated militia. Well, in 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court, and we know the court has changed over the years, decided to erase everything talking about a well-regulated militia and just say there's a right to bear arms. So the Supreme Court said you have a right to bear arms, to have a gun in your house to protect yourself.
And by the way, that was the court. Other courts had entertained that question over many decades and had never come to that conclusion.
Right.
Right. So this was the first court to actually look at it and definitively say, yes, the Second Amendment says that you as an individual have the right to hold and bear arms. Right?
Big change. What Judge Posner said in the Seventh Circuit decision, which came down in December of 2012, was, well, if you have a right to have a gun in your home, you must have a right to have a gun everywhere else. Now, what's particularly strange about this decision was the Supreme Court had anticipated that and said, we're not saying you have a right to have a gun anywhere except in your home. We're certainly not saying you have a right to have a gun, a concealed weapon in public, and they recognized that throughout history, this is one of the main limitations on having guns that had been enacted all across the country. Tombstone, a town that's got a name Tombstone, they said you can't have a weapon in town. So what happens is you got one judge who got it wrong. Actually, two judges, a three-judge panel. So you got Judge Posner writing the opinion and another judge agreeing with him, and then you had another judge dissenting. So basically, you got a wrong decision, and it happens every so often you get wrong decisions. So we're asking that the decision be appealed to the Supreme Court. That's the way the system works.
So what would be your feeling about that appeal to the Supreme Court, given that the Supreme Court seems to have already come down very much on the side of expanding the meaning of the Second Amendment? Do you forecast a successful appeal to the Supreme Court, even if it should happen?
It would be surprising if the Supreme Court let this decision stand because, like I said, their previous decision just a couple of years ago said
it doesn't work that way.
It doesn't work that way. Now, Supreme Court can sort of do whatever it wants, but at the moment, the people of Illinois have already lost. We've lost everything. If this decision is not appealed, then we
then
have
it stands, right?
It stands, and we have to have weapons everywhere, in the grocery store, on the buses, on the streets, in cars, in this studio. Everywhere you're going to have guns. It means everywhere everyone's going to get shot or be afraid of being shot. So we have nothing to lose by taking this appeal.
So what do you have to do to get the appeal? I mean, how does a citizen like you, who, I mean, you're not, you don't run an organization, you don't have millions of dollars backing you, how do you as an individual try to make that happen?
We organized people, just ordinary folks. And we have petitions online, and we send emails, and we make phone calls, and we went down to Lisa Madigan's office, the Attorney General of Illinois, and we had a press conference, and we said, do your job, Lisa. You're supposed to be appealing the decision. You're supposed to be representing us. We are the people of the state of Illinois. We don't want this. You're supposed to be upholding and supporting the laws of the state of Illinois, and the law of the state of Illinois says you can't have these guns, so we simply say, do your job. That's how you do it.
Well, so what kind of surveys or public opinion polls do we have in Illinois that support the position you've just stated, that the majority of people in Illinois do not want concealed carry?
There are lots of opinions and lots of polls, and I'm going to anticipate you might, or some of your viewers might be thinking you can come up with a poll for everything. But in addition to the fact that we think that the most recent polls show that people don't want concealed carry, we know for a certainty that after the massacre at Sandy Hook Elementary School, people are much more concerned about this issue right now. So the polls may not even show the degree to which people are with us in this.
So how do you get those polls, how do you get the politicians' attention? I assume that Ms. Madigan probably did not attend your press conference today. Is that correct?
She may or may not have been watching, but she wasn't there.
She wasn't there, right. Have you had a chance to sit down with her? Has she granted an audience to you? Or I shouldn't say granted an audience. She's a public servant. Have you been able to get into her office and talk to her yet?
We have spoken with her staff, but the important thing we're looking for is not for her to talk to me or any particular person. We want her to talk to the public. She's elected by the whole state. We want her to make a public statement, a public decision. Is she on the side of the guns, or is she on the side of people's lives?
Now, the mayors, Mayor Bloomberg in New York, Rahm Emanuel here, the mayors of big cities seem to be adamantly opposed to this. I mean, they really could, because they manage big cities where they see the effects of gun violence every day. Why aren't they able to step in and make changes here?
Well, they are making changes. New York has a very tough law on concealed carry. Basically, there's two types of carry laws. One is called shall issue, which says the state shall give you a permit if you simply fill out your name and pay your $25. And the other is a may issue state, and that says that the state has discretion whether or not they'll give you a permit. New York is the model of a may issue state, and basically almost no one gets permits to carry concealed weapons in New York.
They set the bar very high. In order to get one, you have to meet certain criteria.
And in some states and in some countries, it goes even further than that. You have to have a real investigation, not just typing it into a computer, not to denigrate people who work in computers, but nonetheless.
But it can be inconclusive.
There can be a need for further things. So things are being done in Chicago and in Cook County recently. There have been any number of measures on a number of gun laws.
In fact, President Preckwinkle, county board president, has come out very much opposed to guns, concealed carry, to handguns generally. But doesn't the federal, the Posner ruling, doesn't that trump all of these other efforts?
Well, unless it's appealed, that ruling says that you have to let people, as a matter of constitutional right,
U.S. Constitution.
U.S. Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, so yes, it will trump. Now, what exactly that will mean is hard to tell because, for instance, the Illinois legislature, in debating whether or not they should pass a law to implement concealed carry, is talking about, do you let people carry guns on CTA buses, for instance? So the head of the CTA said, oh, that's not a good idea at all. But maybe they're going to try and do that. Now, the problem with that is, if Judge Posner is right, and you have a constitutional right to carry a gun, why don't you have a right to carry it on a bus? Why should you be helpless if that makes you helpless? So it's going to be very difficult to justify any law that tries to draw any limitations.
Well, why does the Illinois legislature have to pass a law at all? If it's a constitutional right, as Posner proclaims, then what does Illinois law have to do with it? I would think it would just simply be a matter of, it's a constitutional right, the state has nothing to say about it. I can just carry one and where I want to.
It's undetermined whether or not Judge Posner, what he did was he came out with the decision, said this is unconstitutional, your limitation that says you cannot carry loaded weapons. It's not just concealed, but loaded weapons. He said, but I'll give the legislature 180 days to figure out what to do with it. So it's possible that he would say, okay, you can have some limitations. For instance, you can't have it on a bus, and I'll say that's good enough. Now, whether that really makes sense, according to his decision, saying it's an absolute constitutional right, or whether he's really saying it's a constitutional right, but it's not an absolute right, who knows what that's going to be.
And what kinds of weapons would be covered with this? I mean, in fact, I've heard, might have even been Gary McCarthy, but police chiefs of major cities talk about gun control being an obvious thing, and they say, look, it's just a matter of degree. It says you're not allowed to own a tank, you're not allowed to own a rocket-propelled grenade, so we as police are just saying, well, you're also not allowed to own some of these other types of weapons as well, like high cartridge magazine, high capacity magazines, and the like. So how does that square with an absolute constitutional right to bear arms? Couldn't the other side make the argument that if I have that inherent constitutional right, I should be able to carry an Uzi, which might fit, especially winter, that would fit under my coat, and I should be able to carry a 50-bullet magazine in my Uzi submachine gun anytime, anywhere.
And some people are making that argument, as preposterous as it seems. And there are people in some states, there was an incident in one of the western states the other day where a man walked into the state capitol with an assault rifle over his shoulder, and when an officer came up to him, he said, but I've got a carry permit. And he showed the officer the permit, and the officer had to let him carry an assault rifle in the state capitol.
That seems like an inherently dangerous situation.
Well, that's the interesting thing about it. Judge Posner sits in an office where you can't get into his building without going through metal detectors. You can't have guns in his place. Lisa Madigan's office is in the state of Illinois building where you can't get up the elevators unless you're checked first with a metal detector. You can't have guns there. So who thinks that it makes sense that the rest of us should have to be exposed to these weapons when some of these other people aren't?
Well, wouldn't this ruling then change those buildings as well? So if the ruling stands, then theoretically I could walk into the federal building, I could walk into the state of Illinois building, City Hall, and say, I've got a permit. Let me pass with my concealed Uzi.
I'm not going to recommend you do that.
I'm probably not going to, I'll tell you.
But
theoretically, I could.
What you're saying, you're trying to apply a certain logical standard in these decisions. Clearly, they're not that logical. What you've got is an emotional reaction from people around this country who want to carry guns. It doesn't make any sense. The statistics, the studies all show that the guns make them less safe. Because people who carry guns are more likely to get hurt with their gun or with someone else's gun than someone who doesn't have a gun. But they ignore these studies. They ignore the facts.
Well, as you have just pointed out, most humans, make decisions based more on emotion than on careful intellectual thought. The myth of the rational man is a myth, and has very little bearing, as you know, on actual decision making. So given that people are irrational, and work very much on emotion. Is it, it's hard to think of the right way to phrase this question, is it ethically justifiable for someone in your position, for example, to use this Sandy Hook massacre and others like it as an emotional prod to people to say, or could you be accused of unfairly using a tragedy to manipulate people's emotions?
I think that you're right. Being human means being partly intellectual and partly emotional, and we can't deny either one, and it wouldn't make sense. So in the public debate, we should be taking account of both of these things. I don't feel like I'm manipulating anyone. All I'm doing is pointing out a historical fact, and people can respond to that however they want. The truth of the matter is, women, mothers, particularly all across the country, fathers, men too, but particularly women, saw children being mowed down in an elementary school, and we had a reaction like we haven't seen in a long time. When Gabby Gifford, a congresswoman, was shot on a street, nothing changed. And we've seen Northern Illinois University, we've seen Columbine, all these places that we know because of the mass murders, almost nothing has happened.
Until Sandy Hook.
Until Sandy Hook. And we're seeing things happen all over the country in response to that.
Sadly, that may be the silver lining in that tragedy. Does it take a tragedy? And when we're talking about violence like this, I draw the parallel to the number of people killed in gun violence in large cities every year. Chicago, it's routinely in the hundreds, and some years it surpasses 1,000. New York, decades ago, had 2,000 people killed. Why doesn't that matter? We see all these people, all this mayhem. In fact, there was just, you may have heard it, an extended story on NPR about a public school on the south side of Chicago, in the Roseland neighborhood. And the kids talking about why they had to carry guns. And these are high school kids, right? And the behavior that they exhibit, for example, when they leave school, they all walk down the middle of the streets. They don't walk on the sidewalks. And visitors to the neighborhood often think, well, those are just kids being obnoxious, and they're deliberately blocking traffic because they think it's cool that they can. And when the reporters interviewed the students, they said, no, we're safer in the middle of the street because you've got a wider field of vision. You can see people who might be aiming at you. You can duck to either side. And so we walk down the middle of the street because we don't want to get shot. Yet that doesn't resonate. I mean, that's a horrific image, yet that doesn't seem to resonate with the public. And that goes on in big cities every day.
We have, unfortunately, in the Chicago area and in other cities, a segregated society, segregated by race, segregated by class, segregated by income, however you want to look at it. So that
by all those, I think, right?
And they're intermixed, so that it's fairly easy for some people who don't live in certain areas where the shootings take place on a regular basis to have almost no contact and therefore no concern. But once you meet some of the people who have lost family members, once you realize what it means that a child has to grow up at the age of 12 being aware of walking down the street and not getting shot, and you think about the long-term impact, these people do matter, and that's part of what we're trying to say. The other part that there's very little discussion about is more than half of all shooting deaths in this country are suicides. And these take place in every neighborhood, in every part of the country, in every state.
Every income level.
At every income level. And this is not discussed. And I think it's in part because those people who say they want their guns and say they want to protect themselves can't really account for how can you protect yourself from a suicide?
You can't. Well,
Not with a gun.
Not with a gun, yes, certainly. In countries or in areas where gun ownership is lower, is there a lower suicide rate?
The studies that I've seen show that there is not what they call a substitution. That is, people who might kill themselves with a gun do not, for the most part, kill themselves in any other way. The other thing to look at is, when you're talking about suicide, people who try to kill themselves with a gun are almost always going to succeed. People who try to kill themselves in another way are usually not going to succeed. So the lethality of the weapon, the impulsiveness, the fact that it takes just a moment and one shot does impact it. So yes, where there are fewer guns, you actually have fewer suicides.
Remarkable. And yet, as you've mentioned, that's another part of the story that doesn't seem to resonate. Once again, is it the disconnection because, well, that guy blew his head off, that's his problem, it doesn't affect me, hey, too bad for you, buddy. Do we think that's part of what's going on?
Everyone thinks that they're the good guy. Everyone thinks that they're the gun owners, they think they're going to be the hero. And the fantasy they have is that if you have one of these mass shooting situations, they're going to be the guy sitting in the theater who's going to come out with his gun and save everyone. They've got this superhero image of having secret capes on their backs that they change into. Yeah, there's an awful lot of strangeness going on in what's going through people's heads that totally divorced from the reality of the situation.
It's interesting you mention that because if you read about even the police who are trained, highly trained in the use of firearms, frequently shoot the wrong people, they miss their targets. And so the idea of the average citizen, even this guy wearing the assault weapon going through the state capitol, the idea that that person would actually be able to succeed in this heroic imagination is actually very low.
Ronald Reagan was shot, and he was surrounded by Secret Service agents. One guy walked up and shot him.
So if one guy wants to shoot you, and you happen to have an assault weapon
Let's
slung
not
over your
make
back.
it personal. Don't say me, and not you.
But any individual person, I may carry that assault weapon on my back. That doesn't mean that someone won't see me and think, well, he's nuts, and shoot me in the back of the head, and I never see him coming, right?
What we have to do is have a certain level of faith. And when I talk about faith, some people place their faith in some place, and some place people place it in another. But if we're to live in a civilization, that means we have some concept that we're not all alone, and that we can rely on each other and we can help each other. And that's what countries and states and cities and municipalities are about. That's why we have police departments. That's why we have armies. There's an idea that we're in this together. And this is a concept that people who think that they're going to carry their own gun to protect themselves in all situations, at all hours of the day and night, no matter where they go, they have this basic rejection of the whole notion of civilization.
A pretty strong statement.
I feel strongly about it.
I can see that. And I understand the thought behind that as well. And so it leads me to believe, or it leads me to ask, then the firearm manufacturers who, and actually there's something interesting I read about this, that they face a fundamental problem for their business, and that is most businesses create products that have a limited lifetime. In fact, planned obsolescence is a well-known issue. But even, makers of razor blades, the razors wear out, your cars wear out, even so-called durable goods are not that durable, except firearms. Guns last a really long time because in order to be useful, they have to be built so that they withstand. I mean, the idea of firing a bullet, it's an explosion taking place in the chamber of that gun, so it's under high stress. It has to be built to very exacting standards, and they don't wear out the way durable goods do. So once you've sold X number of guns, those people who own those guns, they don't need to replace it. The gun still works just fine 50, sometimes 100 years later. So the companies themselves have a built-in problem. How do they sell more guns? How do they keep themselves in business? Is that part of what we're seeing here?
That's absolutely what we're seeing. For a number of years, recently, the gun manufacturers are saying get bigger and bigger handguns, be Rambo. Now they're saying, well, everyone seems to have all the big handguns. We're going to sell them small handguns that you conceal, because if you're going to conceal a gun, you need a little. So they're designing actually new types of little guns, and the same thing.
They're still very powerful, very lethal.
Well,
but
they're
just little,
very
right?
lethal. They're just different. What's happened is people no longer go hunting. They don't grow up in in rural areas. It's not that. So the number of people in this country who own guns has been going down for decades. The gun manufacturers' response has been not to find new customers, but to sell more guns to the same customers. So they sell someone an assault rifle. They sell someone a concealable weapon. And the average gun owner owns multiple weapons right now. And yes, that's exactly what's happening. There's a profit motive. This country loves a profit motive. And if you can sell something that'll kill someone and still make a profit, maybe
so be it.
So be it.
So how do you attack that? That's a cultural issue where I went to a talk years ago by the fellow who at that time led the Frito-Lay Corporation. And he said, the problem with my company is we make products that absolutely no one needs. And so how do we sell something that no one needs? And he talked about marketing. So that's a fundamental cultural problem about what is allowable. Is it okay for companies? And in the capitalist model, if you can make a buck at it, pretty much you get to do it. How do we deal with that as a society? Do we need to re-examine what our fundamental beliefs are as a society in order to deal with this issue of what's okay to make a profit at? Killing people, is that okay?
It's the same question that we haven't answered very satisfactorily when we talk about nuclear weapons. It's the same question we haven't answered, I don't think, or even examined too well when we talk about weapons of war and drone warfare and the rest of it. At some point, you're asking, I think, and I'm certainly asking, is there a moral question? Is there an ethical question? Is there a responsibility to anyone, or are we all free to do whatever we want to do, no matter how destructive it is?
Yes, in fact, that is the question I think we have to face. So a deeper philosophical question, and given the nature of television shows, we might not even have time to examine this one, but is the marketing plan of the gun manufacturers destroying the social fabric of America?
I don't know what their plan is. I know that the effect of what they're doing has been very, very bad for this country and for the whole world. I mean, we take a look at what's going on in Mexico. It's fairly easy for us to say, look at those dangerous, violent people, except for most of their guns are coming from us.
Well, in fact, the drugs that they're selling are all sold here in the United States as well. So
it's a small world.
Yes, we are funding that, giving them the guns and giving them the market that they need to sell so they can buy more guns.
There are movements in this country by some municipalities, some universities, to disinvest or divest of companies that make and sell the guns and the weapons. This might have an impact.
A pocketbook issue, right? In other words, if we're talking about dollars and cents, then let's work on the dollars and cents. In fact, Bushmaster, the maker of the gun that was used in Sandy Hook, was put up for sale by the company that owned them. And there were no buyers at first for that very reason. So we only have about 60 seconds left. What is your advice to our viewers here? If they are outraged or otherwise moved, what do they do next?
Become active. Form a group locally. Go to our website, www.stopconcealedcarry.org. Work with any number of different groups in this area, but don't be complacent and don't think it can't happen to you and someone you love.
Lee, thank you so much for being here. I'm sure we'll have you back again. I hope we've made progress by then.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and you can also see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. Till next time, thank you and good night.